Okay, well, this is our podcast here. We're talking about different theoretical considerations in coaching skill. So just to introduce who we are, first, I'm Tim Smith. I'm a high school tennis coach in Utah. I'm the head coach for the girls team at Carl G. Mazur Preparatory Academy, and I'm the director of tennis for the school. So I oversee both programs and make sure they keep moving along. But yeah, that's me. Alyssa, go for it.
All right. So I'm Alyssa Manoogian. I am originally from Boston, Massachusetts. I coach soccer. I've coached at both the collegiate level and the youth levels. I've spent 8 years coaching college soccer at different divisions. Most recently, I've spent the last 5 years at Colgate University, a Division I school in upstate New York. Where I also played my college soccer. And then I've spent the last couple of years helping out coaching a youth club team. So I took a team when they were U9, which was really fun, and kind of saw them progress until they were U13. And so it's been great to see the distinction between those two age groups. But yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell. Jason, you want to?
Yeah, can you hear me? Well, I'm Jason Gardiner. I live here in Nashville, Tennessee. I coach football, high school football, and also high school baseball. And I'm also the strength conditioning coach here as well. I've been doing it for a little while, probably about 8 years for football, and then probably about 6 for baseball. So, it's interesting, definitely for sure.
Very cool. All right, I'm excited to hear. Alyssa and I were talking. I'm excited to hear the team sport perspective from the two of you on these things. So, just to kind of kick things off, I want to talk a little bit about the skill acquisition theoretical consideration that I believe is most effective in tennis. And all of these theories that we talked about were really interesting and I really enjoyed. But the one that I think resonated most with me was the ecological dynamics and linear versus nonlinear pedagogy. And I think why that resonated with me is because that was one that was probably one of the biggest struggles as I became a coach. I got thrown in as a head coach when I probably wasn't ready yet. I'd been an assistant for 3 seasons, but I'd been a very part-time assistant where I was like coming from my day job, I'd show up, a couple practices a week at best. And so I didn't really have a huge opportunity to learn from the great coaches that I was working with. And so I relied a lot on what my high school coaches had done when I was playing. And they were very linear, which certainly has its time and place. I think especially with younger players, that kind of linear practice. And then if we kind of jump into the contextual interference concepts, the blocked practices, they certainly have their place in tennis and helping younger players. My struggle, my first about year and a half of coaching was I was kind of just taking a one size fits all linear approach to my entire team. And my first year, it was an interesting team. We only had 7 girls, and they ranged from fairly experienced to like picked up a tennis racket for the first time on day 1, and hey, congratulations, you're playing varsity tennis because we don't have enough girls for anything else. And so it was a struggle to kind of balance that. And I just took that linear approach of like, hey, here's a demonstration. Now we're going to do a drill that reinforces that skill. And year 2, we managed somehow to grow the team from the 7 girls in year 1 to 17 in year 2. But I still kept that linear approach of like, hey, we're going to treat everybody the same, even though we now had enough girls that, and a range where we could have split off into more groups. And I kept that going. the thing that I remember most about that season is my two senior captains coming to me after. It was like in the middle of a match. We were on this horrific losing streak. Like we were just getting destroyed by everybody. And they came to me and they're like, "Hey, coach, we got to change something about the way we run practices." And obviously they didn't have the terminology and the concepts of linear and nonlinear pedagogy, but what they described to me turns out really was a nonlinear pedagogy. And I was like, you know what, you're probably right. And so we started to split off into groups, and we started to really focus and tailor practices to individual strengths and weaknesses and skill sets. And so rather than just a demonstration in front of everybody, it was, hey, this group, you guys need this, and you play this style, so we're going to focus that way. And one of those captains, I still feel just awful about how I coached her career, because she actually went winless in her senior year at the first singles position. And a lot of that, I think, was a product of linear coaching from me, her previous coaches. And she had great strokes, perfect technique. But when it came time to play, it didn't work. Like, we hadn't prepared her for competition. We prepared her for hitting balls that were fed perfectly to her. Contrast with her younger sister, who's on the team now. And she played second singles this year, went 19-1 on the season, made it to the state semifinals, won a region championship, is now tied for the all-time wins record in the school. Very different experiences, and a lot of it is because I coached her in a very nonlinear way, whereas your strengths are definitely not how you hit the ball, it's how you move on the court. And so we emphasize that, and the practice sessions with her look very different than they did with her older sister, where I'm recognizing, like, I'm not going to get you to hit a 70-80 mile an hour serve. I'm just going to get you to hit the ball and play and position yourself well in the court. So let's focus on drills and practices that are more random, because that's what your strength is. That's where, so we did that, and it's been very, very effective. And the team as a whole has kind of had a similar kind of success. And we, the two seasons that have gone with the nonlinear approach are the first two winning seasons in school history, and we're now a top 10 program in the state. So I don't think that's a coincidence. And one research paper and study that I read as I was kind of studying this topic, it was from Jia Yi Chow. Hopefully I'm saying his name right. He's in the National Institute of Education in Singapore. And what he suggested is, or she, honestly, I probably just butchered that, I have no idea. Anyway, what this researcher suggested was that the nonlinear approach better prepares athletes for competitive settings. And that's what I observed as well over the last few years in my kind of progression as a coach. And it's been really rewarding. And so that to me, I think that's why that nonlinear pedagogy stood out to me so much as we've kind of studied these different topics, is just because my experience has followed that pattern, and I've seen very starkly the contrast between linear and nonlinear, and the benefits that can come from that. But I'm interested to hear, how what you guys think are kind of the most effective and important theories in your sports, or even if you have any thoughts on kind of just the one that I shared there, and how it relates to team sports. I'd love to kind of hear your feedback on that as well.
Yeah, I can jump in here. Before I kind of talk about mine, I want to say I think it's really interesting to hear that you were so open to receiving that kind of feedback or constructive criticism, if you will, from your two senior captains or senior athletes that came and talked to you. I think that that's such an important part of coaching that I've learned over the course of this program in general, is that we are still students of the game, and we're still learning about the ways in which we can best implement practices. And so I know a lot of coaches, and I'm sure you both do as well, that I've come across, whether they be colleagues or friends or coaches that I had, that would be very closed off to that idea of getting any type of constructive criticism or feedback or whatever from an athlete. I think I had plenty of coaches that it was their way no matter what, and the opinions of us didn't matter all that much. And so I definitely want to give you props for that, because
Well,
I think that's an unusual
I
situation, quite
appreciate that.
honestly.
Those are two special players, even though one of them, struggled in the win column. Really special players. I'm glad I listened to them. I'm really glad I
Yeah,
did.
that's such a
And
cool thing for you to be able to look back on and really
yeah,
recognize.
and
Yeah,
hopefully I can kind of continue that, because tennis is such a weird sport. We can't like actively coach, like a lot of coaches are, in sports are able to stand on the sideline yelling during the game or match or whatever, and shouting out instructions. In tennis, we can't do that. We have very
right.
specific and rare opportunities during a match where we can actually provide that coaching. So we need them to be able to think for themselves. And so, it's kind of a byproduct of the sport, and some great senior leadership on the team. And like I said, I'm
Yeah,
glad I
that's
listened to
huge.
him.
Definitely. That's awesome. Yeah, and that kind of piggybacks into my coaching context and what I feel is the most valuable and important part of what we do as soccer coaches. You mentioned that you can't coach during matches, which is kind of a crazy thing. And in soccer, it's a pretty big field, and we don't have timeouts. We're not able to. We can yell. I've done my share of yelling, that's for sure. But it isn't as easy to communicate with my players while they're on the field, unless it's a right back that's running up in front of our sideline, just because it happens to be that way. Otherwise, you're waiting until halftime, really, or until someone comes off to make coaching points that actually make a difference, instead of just yelling kind of generic or big overlapping coaching points. So for me, that takes me into the importance of decision making in the game of soccer. Like you said, they have to be able to think for themselves, and soccer players are very similar in that sense, and that everything that we're doing is preparing them to take what they've learned and apply it to the situation that they're in, which is ever changing in soccer. It's a sport where you don't have control over what the opponents are doing. You never know what that could look like, and so you have to be prepared to make whatever necessary changes come your way. And for that reason, contextual interference is such a huge part of what I do, and I find it extremely valuable in my coaching. I haven't always had the language for it, I would say, in terms of block versus serial versus random practice, but in doing the work in this class and other classes, knowing how important random practice is for me, it really is at the core of all of my training sessions. I see athletes who are at the college level who are coming and they're 18 years old. And so they have skill acquisition is really interesting for 18-year-olds, because they have this foundation of, perhaps 13 to 15 years where they've been learning a skill a certain way. They've had coaches that have done things a certain way. And then I and my staff, we get them. And of course, there are, habits that need to be broken or changed, or there's always development of skill. No one comes in as a master, but they are elite level soccer players and they do have a good understanding. And so I feel like my most important job is helping them make good decisions. And so a couple of ways that we do that is by constantly putting them in competitive game-like environments in training session. And that doesn't mean that they're always playing a full 11v11 scrimmage. We don't have the time or the numbers, quite frankly, to always do that. But putting them in small-sided games where, we've worked maybe the first 10 minutes of practice on more in a blocked way, where we're working on a first touch or a specific type of pass. And then we jump into something that adds a little bit more interference, but is still not heavy on decision making. Maybe it's a passing pattern where they're incorporating multiple skills, right? They have to check their shoulder, they're receiving a ball, they're taking their first touch, and then they're making a pass. But it's always the same. So it's not, they're not worried about a defender coming. They're not worried about if they were out of position to begin with. They're just where they are and they're doing the play. And so that allows them to kind of bridge the gap from blocked to random, because then we jump into, more of a game like realistic situation. And that connects to nonlinear pedagogy, I would say, in terms of putting restraints on the whatever session, whatever activity we're doing, where if we have been working on passing, and I want to get a certain type of I want to see this type of pass a little bit more often, we create a situation where we're playing in a game and they're still worrying about the normal things that they would worry about in a game. But we're doing it in a way where maybe the way that they score a goal is by, making whatever, this 25-yard driven pass, as opposed to scoring a goal on a goal the way they would in a normal game. But it still incorporates the components of a real game. And so I'm a big possession oriented coach. I talked a little bit in my post in this mini module about how I had a youth coach who spent years and years and years instilling in me the importance of being a tactically sound, having a high soccer IQ. And like you said, you took some of your coaches in high school and you applied that to your first year because that was what you knew. I very much did the same thing. And so I really like the possession style of the game. I like how it looks. It I think is the best style of soccer in my opinion. That being said, I wouldn't say that I don't understand the importance of skill acquisition and technical development. I worked with an assistant at Colgate who grew up in a setting where technical blocked training was all they did. And she is incredible. She's an incredible player. She was in college. And we had two very, very different experiences. And so I've been able to learn a lot from her. And this course really opened my eyes to the importance of that, I think. But I still feel strongly that it's important that while we each have our own coaching style and what we're comfortable with and confident in the work and the research that we've done is important, we have to be open to learning and evolving as coaches. And so incorporating high contextual interference that is competitive, that challenges our athletes, maybe forces mistakes, quite frankly. Attentional focus, they talk about if you are adding external cues or the athletes are having to make decisions, sometimes we see a decline in performance, but an increase in learning. That's really what I hope to get out of my athletes, is that they're making the mistakes or they're, maybe experiencing some failures in training. But the goal is that they've learned from it and that they will continue to learn from it. And then they can apply it in a situation that is a little bit more high stakes, for lack of a better word. Of course, no game is super high stakes, but in a situation where it maybe matters and it's not a training session. And so I do everything I can to really design training sessions that involve all types of contextual interference. But for me, the height of it and the most important is definitely random practice, high contextual interference, a lot of decision making, and a lot of reflecting on those decisions that are being made. But yeah, that's kind of, I feel like, what's the most important part of my, the most important theoretical consideration for my coaching context, for sure.
Well, I mean, going off of what you said, I'm pretty much kind of like the same way. We do use block practice. I would say more times when we use it, though, is probably during preseason, because we want them to learn that repetitiveness of this is how you need to step, or this is how you need to go, this is how you need to block, or this is where you need to put your hands. I think we use it, but usually it's more during that preseason time or off season, so that we can start developing them and they can start getting used to actually getting their hands close to the right spot. But with football, it's definitely a lot easier to do it more random. You can actually move it from block to serial and then into random, because serial is just pretty much a little, just the start of a random practice anyways. But and that's kind of like what we do, is that we'll sit there and we'll start off with a block practice during our off season and preseason, just because we want them to get used to that move. I mean, the only player on the field, honestly, that probably can definitely do block practice the whole time is our long snapper, because technically all they got to do is snap the ball and no one can touch them, honestly, when it comes down to it, in the play. When you're in a game and all that stuff. So no one could touch him. So that person right there can pretty much do block practice the whole time, just because his one thing is just snapping the ball. But for everybody else, I think the random practice is definitely a lot better for them, because it lets them make a mistake in practice and it helps them start thinking about it. Because instead of me going up and say, well, you're supposed to do it like this, I use more questioning through my coaching instead, where I'll ask them, well, what were you thinking? And why did you make that? Why didn't you go into this gap instead of that? You know, and I make the player think about what they did so that they're able to see where they made their own mistake at and where they made that choice that they made. And so, you know, I think, you know, doing it that way allows them to utilize a whole bunch of other skills, because especially me coaching the linebackers, our job is we basically got to sit there and I have to see the offensive line through to the running backs. So I got to be able to, one, watch what they're doing. I got to mirror what my offensive lineman is doing while also reading the running back. So I have to do multiple things at once in order for me to be able to do that. And with random practice, you can utilize that and they can actually work on that more. I think setting up more game type scenarios definitely helps them more because they learn a lot faster. To whereas I know in a lot of the research it shows that it takes a little bit longer and you don't see as much improvement. But I think with athletes now these days, honestly, they adapt better that way than the constantly doing it over and over again to a point. I mean, don't get me wrong, like I said, we use block practice a lot, and we use it definitely a lot during the preseason because we want them to get used to knowing this is where I got to try to get my hands at, or this is where I got to take that first initial step, you know. And so we do utilize it, but mostly at that point, because then after that, it's more of we try to put them in situations of what they're going to see during a game.
It's interesting to hear, because I have a similar philosophy too. It's preseason, off season. That's where I use a little bit more blocked. So I'm like reinforcing any technical skill, and then in season it gets a lot more random. You know, I lean toward random practice sessions there. But it was interesting to hear as you two were talking. It's like between our three sports, there's a lot of differences, but it feels like there's a lot more similarities in how we're coaching them than I anticipated here. So this is really interesting.
Yeah, I would agree with that totally.
Oh yeah, I mean, when you sit there and you think about it, I mean, whether it's soccer or it's football, you're still got to teach that one position to somebody, and so you know there is gonna be a lot of similarities in it, because when it's really broken down, it's a lot of individuals in a team sport that we put together that have to do different jobs, and if they're able to do their job, that's what makes that team overall better.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
And I also would agree with you that in terms of the way that we're coaching, I always find that I remember, I think back to when I was playing at the youth level, you know, I played for a solid club team that was one of the best in the country. And so I was getting high level training. But when we would do more blocked type practices, which was not often, like I said, I was bored as a player. I remember feeling like you know, maybe I thought I was getting something out of it, maybe I didn't, but you know, we hear endlessly in this program, Jason, I'm sure you can attest to it, and Tim, you'll find out that being in lines of more than 2 or 3 is not typically the way to go. And so I remember when I was in game situations, and I see it now, you know, for a warm-up game, instead of doing, you know, a kind of stagnant thing that works on passing, we'll play like kind of a fun warm-up game that it's high tempo, it's a little bit competitive, but it's fun, it's lighthearted, and they enjoy it and they get way more out of it, and we're ultimately accomplishing the same goal, but in a way where they're invested in it and it's something that they're excited about, as opposed to being like, all right, we're going to do, you know, line passing for 20 minutes and you're going to be bored out of your mind after the first 5. Like, that's just the way it goes. And I think it's different, you know, with different aged athletes, and you need some of that block practice a little bit more with younger athletes, I would say, when you're actually like teaching the skill. But for me, like being able to make it as fun and as competitive as possible, I know has been a huge plus for my athletes. And I can remember as an athlete feeling that way as well.
Completely
agree. I mean, I have to agree with that completely, you know, because I mean, you know, it is easier to get the younger kids to, especially your younger athletes, to do the block practice, because they can that's what they're there for, is to learn those first fundamentals. When you do get in high school, that's why we usually only do it in preseason or something like that, because it's basically, okay, we're going to do this for so many minutes and then we're going to move on to the next thing. Because they do. High school kids, they'll get lost. They'll start looking at the butterflies and the squirrels running around before they'll start doing anything else. And so you have to find a way to keep them engaged. And, so we'll go through the block practice, but as soon as we do, we'll go and make them do something that gets them engaged again really quickly. Or it's more of a rotation kind of thing. We'll set up rotations of block practices where you're doing it over and over and over again, and we do it for about a minute, and then the whistle blows. Now you go to this next station. You'll do some other type of block practice, doing something else. Just to make it a little bit more interesting. Because yes, I agree totally. You can definitely lose your athletes with block practice if you don't watch it.
Yeah, and I think that's too where we can get into the observational learning a little bit too. Is if we kind of split into smaller groups, or even do kind of the dyad training and dyad learning, where we just have two of them, and one of them's performing, if it's a blocked skill, one of them's performing that blocked practice while the other one's observing and then providing feedback and then doing it themselves, and roles reverse. Because in those smaller groups, I feel like that's the only way to keep them engaged. Because Alyssa, like you said, and far too many tennis coaches do this, where it's like, yeah, you have your entire team, and I did it for a while. Yeah, your entire team lined up. One of them steps up to the baseline. You hit them 5 forehands, 5 backhands. Next person up. It's like you have 10 minutes before you step up to that line again. They're completely checked out. Observational learning is non-existent at that point. But if you can have them smaller groups, quicker rotations, and with the emphasis of like, hey, you are going to provide that feedback after to your partner. And in tennis, that's again where I can kind of go with a little more nonlinear and partner people based on skill set, where it's like, okay, I have someone who's got, big, powerful strokes and wants to end points quickly. I can partner with them with someone else who has big, powerful strokes and want to end point quickly. And so they can kind of provide that feedback to each other and strengthen each other because they have similar approaches and similar playing styles. And then when I come over, I'm giving feedback that can similarly apply in both, rather than, again, trying to one size fits all, or again, a long line where they're not getting engaged and they're bored out of their minds.
For sure. I think that opens up to that second question really well, in terms of how we implement some of these theories, and how you just talked about observational learning. Observational learning is absolutely a huge part of what I do as well. And the most impactful advice that I ever got was at a coaching course a couple of years ago. I was getting like one of my coaching licenses for soccer. And the director said, never demo a skill that you cannot do proficiently. And so I think it's an interesting concept because, again, it varies for ages, I would say, but I've had coaches at a young age that demoed a skill that they had no business demoing. Looking back, at the time I didn't know they were doing it wrong, but looking back, it's just like, and I see it with my youth athletes because I coach club soccer, which is kind of, it's not super high level, but it is higher level than like ASO, for example, which is like town soccer. Kind of anyone can coach that. And a lot of times in soccer, we see parents coaching that, and parents who've never played soccer a day in their life.
Oh, I played soccer, but still, I have no business coaching it.
No, there's such a need for it, right? There's so much youth soccer all over the country that there's not enough coaches that are like, qualified coaches. So it's awesome that we have parents step in. But a lot of times those coaches are setting their athletes back a little bit. I had my youth athletes, my U10 girls, who are good, but they're not that good. But they would come and we would have a season and we would progress, and I could see the progression happening. And then they would go and they would play for their town over the summer or whatever fun. And I would get them back, and it was like I had to unteach a bunch of stuff because they were practicing bad habits. And a lot of it was because of the demos they were seeing, the observational learning from their coaches and each other. And so that's a really interesting point that I got, was never to demo something that you can't do proficiently. And so for that reason, I could play soccer in my day, but it's been a while. 5 orthopedic surgeries later, I'm not at the top of my game, I would say. And so I use my athletes a ton for observational learning. I use them to demo things all the time. And often what I'll do is I'll have them demo a skill, and then have the, you know, whoever's performing it perform it. And if changes need to be made, then maybe I'll jump in and do a demo or half of a demo or whatever. But I like the idea of them learning from each other as opposed to just learning from me as a coach, who it feels kind of like I'm dictating their play. And I read a study by Hancock et al. In 2010, and they talked about using the language of emulating versus copying in regard to observational learning. And that was really interesting to me because, you know, we think of a demo, I do a demo, you then are trying to perform that same exact skill in the way that I did it. And while that is the case, the difference between emulating and copying is that emulating allows for people to have their own understanding of it. It's going to be different for everybody. You know, my 5'11" center back might take a shot and it's going to look different from my forward who's 5'4". Their strides are totally different. Their approach to the ball is different, but it's still a low driven shot. It's still the same thing. And so understanding that we each have our own, you know, our own level of understanding of the skill, our own biomechanics when it comes to the skill. So it's not, I'm not trying to copy you. I'm trying to do that skill, but in a way that works for me and my body and my level of understanding. And so that language really jumped out at me, and it's something that I hadn't really thought about too much. But I think it's an important thing to consider when we think about observational learning, in that everyone is different. We have to have an individualistic approach, even in a team sport setting. We have to understand that we're not comparing ourselves to one another. Our athletes, that's a big thing, especially, you know, for 18 to 22-year-old women, is that there is no comparison here. You know, you bring what you bring to the table, and we learn and we grow, but it's not going to look exactly the same for everybody. And that's okay. And that's part of learning.
I love that, because I've discovered over the last little bit that it's more impactful for a lot of my players if they see one of their teammates demonstrating.
Totally.
And I think some of it is like, I'm 6'3". I've been playing tennis for 17 years and I serve well over 100 miles an hour. If I'm out there demonstrating a serve, they're like, you're a foot taller than me, coach, and you've been playing for a lot longer, and I'm never going to serve that fast. So why am I trying to copy you?
Match that,
Yeah, why am I trying to match that? So that's a really interesting look at that. And you know, and I agree. I think sometimes we can put that unintentional pressure on them to like, hey, be like me, or be like Roger Federer or Serena Williams, or, you know, it's like, no, we're emulating, we're not copying exactly.
Yeah,
we're
that language was huge for me.
that.
Yeah,
I really like that.
For sure. Do either of you guys want to talk about maybe another way to implement one of these? Yeah, Jason, jump in.
Well, like for observational learning, what I do is sometimes especially with football, that's the greatest thing, because all these kids want to implement something that they saw in some game and they want to try to do. So, I mean, the biggest thing I say, especially for me, is I would sit there and I'll actually figure out who is their favorite football player. And then I'll actually find the film and the footage of them actually performing what I want them to do. And I'll actually show it to them and be like, this is how I want you to do it. Because when we'll go into film, because we'll do film at least once or twice a week, just watch our practices and see what we're doing wrong. And actually, that's when I'll actually show them the video. Goes, well, this is your guy that you like to watch. You see how he's doing it. You see, you know, and then I'll walk them through it. You know, and it does a lot of things, because I think with them being able to see that, they know how it's done correctly to a point now. To whereas when also another thing I'll do is I'll implement like a mentoring program. So my older guys will actually take on one of the younger guys, whether it's a freshman or a sophomore. And they're going to be there and they're going to mentor them through this whole thing. And what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to watch each other, see where they're making each other's mistakes, what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong. You know, and the reason why I kind of did that was because, you know, it showed that when that skilled athlete and that novice athlete worked together, they were able to see that they could learn more, you know, and even with an article that I read, and was by Haynes, Elliott, and Bennett, that sat there and said that, you know, with them being able to observe even the younger player doing it, they could see how they were doing it wrong, or they could see where they were doing it right at and how they could help them fix it as well. And so implement it with the videos, implement with them doing the mentoring program. And then also another way is I would use Coach's Eye, because you can use that with on your phone, you can use it as an iPad or whatever. We always have iPads around because we use those for our film. And so I'll sit there and I'll record it, and then just to sit there and let them watch it again, because they ain't gonna believe you. Because that's one thing I've learned really quick. They won't believe you because they'll think they're always doing it right. But when you show them video, they sit there and they're like, "Whoa, wait a minute, yeah, you're completely right." And I was like, "Yeah." And so, and the great thing is you can draw on it right there. And usually what I'll do is I'll hand them the iPads, like, "You look and see what you did right, what you did wrong. I'm gonna go work with the next guy." And then while they're looking, we would just switch. And then their mentor usually walks over and they start talking about it too. It's like, "No, man, you're doing it wrong here or there," And so it helps them learn from each other even more. So, I think that's kind of like how I implement this into my teaching my linebackers how to play the sport.
I love that. I love that mentor process. That was huge for me as a player my freshman year. Because I mentioned before, my coaches were very blocked practice, very linear pedagogy, but it was an upperclassman on the team. He was playing varsity. I was like bottom of the JV ladder when I got cut from the baseball team. That's how I started in tennis. So I'm like learning this brand new sport, and this kid just pulls me aside and he'd stay with me after practice, and we'd go for hours and doing things differently. And he was very non-linear in how he mentored me, so that worked out. But just having a mentor period was huge in my development. So I love that approach to it, and matching up an upperclassman with a lowerclassman, and more experienced with less experienced, and kind of helping them help each other. I love that.
And I mean, and that was a great thing, because I mean, when you did it too, that whole thing with competition and the players standing around, that kind of goes away, because then they're all getting involved. They're all coaching basically on the sideline. I mean, and you listen to make sure that they're actually telling them the right thing, they're giving them the right cues and the right feedback. But it's, just to see how they react while they're on the field and they're doing it, it's awesome, because like I said, it brings that competition up even that much more, because
I think you're willing to work more for your teammates, quite frankly. Like,
oh yeah.
I remember in college when my coaches would be like, "All right, this is a training packet, make sure you're doing it, the workouts every summer." Hearing that from my coaches did not mean as much as hearing it from one of my teammates, who was like, "I'm doing this, like, we're doing this for a reason. Like, we're trying to win a championship this year. So, like, get your butt out there and start working out." Like, that meant more and was more of a driving force in my motivation than, a coach always saying, "You have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do this." So having that type of like camaraderie, I think, is so important in all sports.
Oh yeah, for sure. I have to agree, because I mean, just seeing them, it was funny, because I mean, they would sit there, and when the younger kid would come up and guard the other senior that had a different mentee and all that stuff, just to hear him, he goes, "Oh, my guy, I just got you," and just going after each other. And I mean, it was fun. It was, the mentality that's out there once you do stuff like that, it's a lot better. And I think it makes practices definitely go a lot better as well.
For sure.
Love these ideas. Watch out, Mazer Tennis. You got some new things coming your way. Thank you.
Jump into maybe a quick summary of, because I think we're probably close to the 40-minute mark. A quick summary of what we feel like are maybe some of the most important takeaways here.
Yeah, there's one point I was going to make with like knowledge of performance versus knowledge of results, because I feel like we've touched on a lot of these other topics, even attentional focus, and just kind of keeping things, at least in tennis, we try and keep things external more in terms of our focus. When we're teaching new players, it's a lot of times it's a lot closer to their body, what that external focus is, with like keeping your racket angle, in the proper position or whatever. And then further on, it's like, well, where'd that ball land? You're worried about, where was your opponent positioned, and those kinds of things. But when we talk about knowledge of performance versus knowledge of results and that kind of thing, in tennis at least, it's not really a KP versus KR debate necessarily. There's elements of that, and there's certainly value in both, and there's elements of that. But for me, the more important thing to distinguish them is it extrinsic or intrinsic feedback that these athletes are getting. Because if it's extrinsic that they're relying on, if it's me that they're relying on, and I think you two have kind of touched on this a little bit as well, that's kind of a problem when you get into a game setting, right? It's been interesting hearing the two of you talk. And Alyssa, you mentioned, you have a big field, it's continuous action. You don't have a chance to provide that constant feedback. They got to make the decision themselves. As same thing over here in tennis is I need them to self-diagnose and provide their own feedback in the middle of a match, because they can't talk to me for a little while. Like, they got a couple of games before they can talk to me again. And so I need them to be providing that intrinsic. And so a lot of the things that we work on in practice are to help them through that decision making. One of the things that I've loved to do is we'll play, I call them stop and go points. And so they'll be out, they'll play a point, and then they'll stop, they'll discuss it with each other and what they could improve, and then they go back. So they're constantly diagnosing point by point what was happening and going from there. But I just wanted to touch on that a little bit, because I think KP and KR is something we hadn't really, that feedback in general is something we hadn't really touched on. But
I totally agree with that. I think that type of ability to allow for like some reflection, we'll do that too, where we'll play a possession style game, and it'll be pretty fast paced. And instead of, at the end of the game, we're not bringing them all in, talking about the whole situation. We're saying, take a minute and a half with your team, figure out what's working, figure out what's not working, maybe address 2 or 3 things that you need to fix and that you can fix in this quick time, and then play again, see what changes have been made. And then when we split up, they each get a coach, and we talk like, what were some of your goals for that game? What did you recognize wasn't going well? And what was your game plan to fix it? Were you able to do it? If so, how? If not, why? Like, having those conversations that are very honest and open, and saying, this didn't go well, because I think we talked about it. Every kid thinks they're doing everything right all the time. That's just the way it is. But to be able to say, wow, like, my first touch was so off in that sequence. I don't know why, I need to fix it. Or as a team defensively, we were just not organized. We couldn't get organized. And so having those conversations among themselves, and then, maybe with some type of a coach or a mentor, allows for really open, honest communication. And that's why I think knowledge of performance in my setting is more valuable than knowledge of results, because we're talking about the whole process. We're not just talking about the results, quite frankly. But I think, the kind of last thing I'll say is, for me, the biggest takeaway in this whole course, all of these kind of things we've talked about, is that there's a place for all of it in coaching, right? We talk about what's best suits our coaching and in our coaching context. And that's great. Like I said in the beginning, you should have your coaching style. That should be important to you. But you have to be open to everything, because there is a time and a place for block practice in my setting, even though it doesn't really seem like it on the surface. It's not the way that I played soccer growing up. And so having an understanding that we need to find the balance, that's what this all is about. I think all of these things where we're kind of putting one thing against the other, that's great. But there's always going to be a time for, an internal cue versus an external cue. And so understanding when those moments are and the ways that we can implement it, for me, was the absolute biggest takeaway from this course, for sure.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'd have to agree with you on that, because looking at it and looking and doing all the research and reading all these articles, you can see how all this stuff is implemented and how it's taken care of. And I think that with, the feedback and all that as well, is that it's important for an athlete to get feedback from their peers just as much as it is from the coach. Because like you said, Leslie, because they're going to sit there and they're going to respond more to them because it's someone that's their age. And so I think that, everything that you're talking about is right. It's the best way for anybody to learn how to coach. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for any coach to take from this class, for sure, is you need to make sure that you can change your style if you have to, though, because you can't always stay with the same style that you're with. Because I have those coaches that I've coached with that they'll do everything the old school way, as we would say in football, but it's not going to get them anywhere. And it gets them to the same results every season. To whereas I used to be that way when I first started, and then slowly throughout time and learning from other coaches and learning in this program that I'm going to have to change so that I can actually make that same change with my players, because my players aren't going to respond to the same way as I responded when I was a football player.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way. They're not going to, your soccer players aren't going to respond the way you used to respond as a soccer player.
No.
Or
there's a constant evolution. Yeah.
And if you're not willing to step back, get feedback as well, and then make that change, you won't be successful as a coach. But if you're willing to do that, and you're willing, it's going to be weird, because it's weird trying to implement half the stuff that I learned here and try to implement it on the football field, and all the coaches look at you like, what are you doing? That's not, I was like, that ain't going to work. I was like, give it a minute, you'll see. And then they're like, oh wait, that does work. It's like, yeah, you can't be scared to try something. And so, and I think that's why a lot of coaches, especially in football, I can tell you that right now, that's why a lot of coaches fail in football, because they're not willing to change and make that difference, especially from the things you learn here. Because like we said, there's not many professors that really know a lot about football. Soccer, we got that one, and we got it all for a lot of other sports. But implementing something that I learned from soccer coaches and I put it on the football field, it works just as well as it probably would if it was for tennis as well. So
yeah, a lot of it's universal. That's a pretty cool takeaway, I think.
Yeah, and I loved what you were saying of just kind of that individual approach too. It's we can't just do things the way we've always done it. We need to adapt to our own strengths as coaches. We need to adapt to our players' strengths as well, and the way that they respond to different things, the way that we respond. Like coaches and athletes are so similar, I'm learning, and just the way that we need to learn and approach and develop ourselves too. But yeah, I think, in this discussion today, that's one of my key takeaways as well, is that whether it's a player or a coach, we need to be responsive and adaptive and willing to learn and change and implement, all these things that we're learning in textbooks and studies, and then all the things that we learn from each other as well. Because Jason, like you said, whether it's soccer, football, baseball, basketball, like there are a lot of things that we can learn and apply in our own sports, and take these concepts to just, move things forward in the sport that we're working with.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll say this, because I learned this from a basketball coach, because I'm doing all my reading like I'm John Wooden. He sat there and said, the day you sit there and say that you've learned everything, the day you need to stop coaching, because there's always something to learn.
So true. There are too many coaches who don't agree that aren't aware of that don't have this the self-awareness to step away when
the tennis courts are full of them.
I know that. I learned that because one of my coaches that I coach with at one of my other schools, he, no kidding, walked into the room with all the rest of us and said, well, how do you think you should feel when you're the smartest one in the room? And you're like, we're at a coaching clinic, and I'm like, what are you talking about? I was like, that's a college coach and you're in high school. I'm pretty sure that's something more than we do.
Those kind of coaches are everywhere, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Hopefully there's enough up and coming coaches, and then coaches who have been coaching for a while that have the ability to self-reflect and take a look in the mirror and say, what worked for me 30 years ago doesn't apply as much today, or the game's changed, so I need to change. And again, it's all about balance, because it would be crazy to say that I worked with a woman who coached for 30 years and is the most winning coach in history at the university. And she's so highly sought after in terms of coaching positions. And that's great. And I learned so much from her. However, there are parts of her coaching style that worked in the 80s that don't work now. They don't. And if she's not willing or we're not willing to take a look and say, well, why or how, or how can I implement some of the ways that I used to coach, but make it a little bit more in line with the game today and the athletes today,
there's a disconnect. That disconnect is happening so much with some of these coaches who've been around for a very long time, but don't have the ability to self-reflect.
Oh yeah,
Yep,
I agree.
definitely. There's a place for all of this, and
Yeah,
Yeah,
we got to
totally.
implement all of it.
We definitely do.